It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Brookfield. The sun was shining brightly, and the streets were calm, with only a few cars passing by. A black sedan was parked near the corner of Maple Street, its engine idling softly. Inside the car sat a man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp suit. He was a respected judge in the county, known for his fairness and integrity. Today, he was on his way home after a long day at the courthouse. His mind was occupied with the cases he had presided over, and he was looking forward to some rest. As he drove down the familiar road, he noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. The flashing lights came on, and the siren blared briefly, signaling him to pull over. The judge frowned slightly, wondering what he had done wrong. He was sure he hadn't been speeding or breaking any traffic rules. Nevertheless, he calmly pulled his car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The police officer stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his sunglasses as he approached the sedan. He was a tall man with a stern expression, his uniform neatly pressed. The judge rolled down his window, ready to explain himself if needed. The officer leaned slightly, his eyes scanning the interior of the car before settling on the driver. "License and registration, please," the officer said, his tone firm but not overly harsh. The judge nodded and reached into his glove compartment, pulling out the required documents. He handed them over without a word, his demeanor calm and composed. The officer took the papers and glanced at them briefly before looking back at the driver. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "No, officer, I don't," the judge replied politely. "I believe I was driving within the speed limit and following all traffic laws." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step back and began to walk around the car, his eyes scrutinizing every detail. The judge watched him quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He could sense the tension in the air, but he remained patient, knowing that cooperation was the best way to handle the situation. After a few moments, the officer returned to the driver's side. "Step out of the car, please," he instructed, his tone now more commanding. The judge hesitated for a second but complied. He opened the door and stepped out, standing tall and composed. The officer gestured for him to move to the side of the road, away from the car. The judge followed the instructions, his mind racing as he tried to understand what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he began to pat the judge down, his hands moving quickly and efficiently. The judge remained still, his expression calm but his thoughts swirling. He had never been in this position before, and it was an uncomfortable feeling. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but the situation was escalating in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the officer finished the pat-down, he stepped back and looked at the judge with a scrutinizing gaze. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said finally, his tone still firm. The judge raised an eyebrow. "What description is that?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. The officer hesitated for a moment before responding. "A suspect involved in a recent incident in the area. We're just doing our job." The judge nodded slowly, understanding the officer's position but also feeling a sense of unease. He knew that racial profiling was a reality, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was playing a role in this encounter. Still, he remained composed, determined to handle the situation with dignity. "I understand," the judge said calmly. "But I assure you, I'm not involved in any incident. I'm actually on my way home from work." The officer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked back to his patrol car, taking the judge's license and registration with him. The judge stood by the side of the road, his hands at his sides, waiting patiently. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, but he ignored them, focusing on staying calm. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The judge glanced at his watch, realizing that this was taking longer than it should. He knew that the officer was likely running his information through the system, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Finally, the officer returned, his expression slightly different now. He handed the documents back to the judge and cleared his throat. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone less stern than before. "You're free to go." The judge took the papers and nodded. "Thank you, officer," he said politely, though he couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. He got back into his car, started the engine, and drove away, his mind still processing what had just happened. As he continued his journey home, the judge couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a routine traffic stop. He knew that as a black man, he was no stranger to such situations, but this one felt different. It was a reminder of the challenges he faced, even in his position of authority and respect. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would change both his and the officer's lives forever. The encounter on Maple Street was a turning point, a moment that would force both men to confront their own biases and the realities of the world they lived in. And as the judge drove away, the officer stood by his patrol car, watching the sedan disappear into the distance. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a nagging thought that he had just made a mistake that would come back to haunt him. The judge arrived home, his mind still preoccupied with the earlier encounter. He parked his car in the driveway and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The house was quiet, and he was grateful for the solitude. He stepped inside, greeted by the familiar warmth of his home, but the weight of the day's events lingered. As he settled into his favorite chair, he replayed the incident in his mind. The officer's stern expression, the pat-down, the vague explanation about a suspect matching his description, it all felt off. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the experience left him unsettled. It was a reminder that, despite his position and accomplishments, he was still seen through a lens of suspicion by some. Meanwhile, the police officer returned to the station, his shift nearing its end. He sat at his desk, filling out the necessary paperwork for the traffic stop. As he wrote, his thoughts drifted back to the encounter. There was something about the man's calm demeanor and the way he carried himself that stuck with him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it nagged at him. Later that evening, the officer decided to look up the license plate number he had run during the stop. He typed the information into the system, curious to see if there was anything he had missed. When the results came up, his stomach dropped. The name and title associated with the license plate were unmistakable. The man he had pulled over was a judge. The officer leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He felt a mix of embarrassment and anxiety. He had treated a judge with suspicion, even going so far as to pat him down. What if the judge decided to file a complaint? What if this incident affected his career? The officer's thoughts spiraled as he considered the potential consequences. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse as usual. He greeted his colleagues with his customary warmth, but those who knew him well could sense that something was bothering him. He tried to focus on his work, but the memory of the traffic stop kept resurfacing. By midday, he decided to address it. He called a trusted friend and fellow judge to discuss what had happened. Over coffee, the judge recounted the incident, his tone measured but his frustration evident. His friend listened carefully, nodding in understanding. "It's a tough situation," the friend said. "But you handled it with grace. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" The judge sighed. "I don't know. Part of me wants to let it go, but another part feels like I can't just ignore it. This isn't just about me, it's about the bigger picture." His friend nodded. "You're right. These kinds of encounters happen too often, and they need to be addressed. But it's up to you to decide how to move forward." The judge spent the rest of the day weighing his options. He knew that filing a formal complaint could lead to an investigation, but he also knew it could make a difference. It wasn't just about holding the officer accountable, it was about sparking a conversation and pushing for change. Meanwhile, the officer couldn't shake his guilt. He replayed the encounter in his mind, questioning his actions. He had been so focused on doing his job that he hadn't considered the impact of his approach. The realization that he had treated a judge with unnecessary suspicion was a wake-up call. He knew he needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. That evening, the officer made a decision. He would reach out to the judge and apologize. It was a bold move, and he wasn't sure how it would be received, but he felt it was the right thing to do. He found the judge's contact information through the courthouse directory and drafted a message. It was short and to the point, expressing his regret for the way he had handled the situation, asking for an opportunity to speak in person. The judge was surprised when he received the message. He read it several times, considering how to respond. The officer's apology seemed sincere, and it took courage to reach out. After some thought, he decided to agree to a meeting. He replied, suggesting a time and place where they could talk privately. The following day, the two men met at a small cafe near the courthouse. The atmosphere was tense at first, both unsure of how to begin. The officer broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I want to apologize for how I treated you during the traffic stop," he said. "I was wrong, and I realize now that I let my assumptions get the better of me." The judge listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for reaching out," he said. "I appreciate your apology, but I think we need to talk about why this happened in the first place." The officer nodded, understanding the judge's point. "You're right. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the biases we carry and how they affect the way we do our jobs." The two men spent the next hour discussing their perspectives, sharing their experiences, and reflecting on the broader issues at play. It was a difficult but necessary conversation, one that left both of them with a lot to think about. As they parted ways, the judge felt a sense of hope. The encounter had been challenging, but it had also opened the door for dialogue and understanding. The officer, too, felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He knew he had a lot of work to do, but he was committed to making changes, both in himself and in his approach to his job. The incident on Maple Street had been a turning point, not just for the two men involved, but for the community as a whole. It was a reminder that change begins with difficult conversations and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The meeting at the cafe left both the judge and the officer with much to reflect on. For the judge, it was a reminder of the systemic issues that still plagued society, even in a town as small as Brookfield. For the officer, it was a moment of self-awareness, a realization that his actions had consequences far beyond a routine traffic stop. Over the next few days, the judge found himself thinking more deeply about the incident. He knew that his experience was not unique, countless others had faced similar situations, often with far worse outcomes. He began to consider how he could use his position to address these issues, not just in the courtroom but in the community as well. He decided to reach out to local leaders and organizations to discuss ways to promote understanding and reduce bias. The officer, too, was determined to make a change. He started by researching implicit bias and attending workshops on cultural sensitivity. He realized that his training had focused primarily on enforcing the law, with little emphasis on understanding the people he was sworn to protect and serve. He began to approach his job differently, taking the time to listen and engage with the community rather than simply enforcing rules. One afternoon, the officer was patrolling a neighborhood when he noticed a group of teenagers playing basketball in the park. In the past, he might have driven by without a second thought, but this time he decided to stop and watch for a moment. As he observed, one of the teenagers noticed him and waved. The officer hesitated but then waved back. The teenager approached the patrol car, his expression curious but friendly. "Hey, officer," the teenager said. "Everything okay?" The officer nodded. "Yeah, just checking things out. You guys play here often?" The teenager smiled. Yeah, every day after school. You should join us sometime. The officer chuckled, surprised by the invitation. I might just do that, he said. I used to play back in the day. The teenager grinned. Cool. We could use another player. As the officer drove away, he felt a sense of connection that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a small moment, but it reminded him of the importance of building relationships with the community he served. Meanwhile, the judge was making progress of his own. He had organized a meeting with local leaders, including the police chief, to discuss ways to address bias and improve community relations. The meeting was productive, with everyone agreeing on the need for more training and open dialogue. The judge also proposed creating a community advisory board to provide input on policing practices and ensure accountability. The police chief was initially hesitant but eventually agreed to the idea. It's not going to be easy, he said. But I think it's a step in the right direction. The judge nodded. Change never is easy, but it's necessary. We owe it to the community to do better. As the weeks passed, the town of Brookfield began to see small but meaningful changes. The officer continued to engage with the community, attending local events and even joining the teenagers for a game of basketball. The judge's efforts led to the formation of the advisory board, which quickly became a platform for open and honest conversations. Both men knew that there was still a long way to go, but they were committed to the journey. The incident on Maple Street had been a catalyst for change, not just for them but for the entire community. It was a reminder that progress begins with understanding and that even the smallest actions can make a difference. The changes in Brookfield were gradual but noticeable. The Community Advisory Board, spearheaded by the judge, held its first public meeting at the town hall. The room was packed with residents, police officers, and local leaders, all eager to voice their thoughts and concerns. The atmosphere was tense at first, but the judge's calm and inclusive approach helped set the tone for a productive discussion. One by one, residents stood up to share their experiences. Some spoke of positive interactions with the police, while others recounted stories of feeling unfairly targeted. The officers in attendance listened intently, their expressions a mix of discomfort and determination. The judge made sure everyone had a chance to speak, emphasizing the importance of honesty and respect. When it was his turn to address the crowd, the judge spoke from the heart. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, he said. It's about understanding each other and working together to make our community safer and more inclusive for everyone. The police chief also took the podium, acknowledging the need for change. We're here to serve you, he said. And if we're falling short, we need to know how we can do better. This is just the beginning, but I'm committed to making sure our department reflects the values of this community. The meeting ended on a hopeful note, with residents and officers alike expressing a willingness to work together. The advisory board scheduled regular meetings and began developing initiatives to address the concerns raised, such as bias training for officers and community outreach programs. Meanwhile, the officer who had pulled over the judge continued to reflect on his own journey. He had started attending the advisory board meetings, not as a representative of the police force but as an individual eager to learn. He listened to the stories shared by residents, many of which mirrored the judge's experience. It was a humbling process, but it reinforced his commitment to change. One afternoon, the officer decided to take his efforts a step further. He approached the judge after a meeting and asked if they could speak privately. The judge agreed, and the two men stepped outside into the cool evening air. I just wanted to thank you, the officer said, his voice sincere. That day on Maple Street, it was a wake-up call for me. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now how much I still have to learn. The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. I appreciate that, he said. Change isn't easy, but it starts with conversations like this. You're taking steps in the right direction, and that's what matters. The officer hesitated for a moment before continuing. I was wondering if, maybe you'd be willing to mentor me. I know I've got a long way to go, and I think your perspective could help me understand things better." The judge was surprised but touched by the request. He could see the sincerity in the officer's eyes and recognized the courage it took to ask for guidance. After a moment, he extended his hand. "I'd be honored," he said. "Let's work on this together." From that day forward, the two men began meeting regularly. They discussed everything from personal experiences to broader societal issues, each conversation deepening their understanding of one another. The officer shared his struggles with overcoming bias, while the judge offered insights into the challenges faced by marginalized communities. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to growth. As word of their collaboration spread, it inspired others in the community to follow suit. Residents and officers began engaging in more open and honest conversations, breaking down barriers that had long divided them. The town of Brookfield was slowly but surely becoming a model for how communities could come together to address difficult issues. The journey was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. The judge and the officer, once on opposite sides of a tense encounter, were now united in their efforts to build a better future for their community. The partnership between the judge and the officer began to have a ripple effect throughout Brookfield. Their willingness to engage in open dialogue and work together inspired others to do the same. The Community Advisory Board's initiatives gained momentum, and the town started to see tangible changes. One of the first projects the board implemented was a series of workshops on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. These workshops were mandatory for all police officers and open to the public. The judge helped facilitate some of the sessions, sharing his own experiences and encouraging participants to reflect on their biases. The officer also played an active role, speaking candidly about his journey and the lessons he had learned. The workshops were eye-opening for many. Officers who had never considered the impact of their actions began to see things from a different perspective. Residents, too, gained a better understanding of the challenges faced by law enforcement. The sessions were often emotional, but they fostered a sense of empathy and mutual respect. One evening, after a particularly impactful workshop, the judge and the officer sat down for coffee. They reflected on the progress that had been made and the work that still lay ahead. "I never thought I'd see the day when officers and residents would sit down and have these kinds of conversations," the judge said, a note of pride in his voice. The officer nodded. "It's been a humbling experience. I've learned so much, not just from you but from everyone who's shared their stories. It's made me realize how much we all have in common." The judge smiled. "That's the key, isn't it? Finding common ground. It's not about ignoring our differences but understanding them and working together despite them." As the weeks went by, the town continued to see positive changes. The police department introduced new policies aimed at reducing bias and improving accountability. Officers were encouraged to engage with the community, whether through neighborhood patrols, school visits, or participation in local events. The advisory board also launched a mentorship program, pairing officers with community members to foster stronger relationships. One of the most significant developments was the creation of a youth outreach program. The officer who had once pulled over the judge took the lead on this initiative, drawing inspiration from his encounter with the teenagers in the park. The program aimed to build trust between young people and law enforcement through activities like sports, art, and community service. The program's first event was a basketball tournament held at the local community center. The officer, along with several of his colleagues, joined the teenagers on the court. The atmosphere was lively and full of laughter, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined their interactions. As the officer dribbled the ball down the court, he couldn't help but smile. This was what community policing was all about: building connections, breaking down barriers, and creating a sense of unity. The teenagers, too, seemed to appreciate the effort, cheering on the officers and even playfully teasing them about their basketball skills. The judge attended the tournament, watching from the sidelines with a sense of pride. He saw the impact of their work in the smiles and camaraderie on display. It was a reminder that change, while often slow and difficult, was possible. As the event came to an end, the officer approached the judge. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We've got a long way to go, but I'm committed to keeping this momentum going." The judge nodded. "We all are. And as long as we keep working together, there's no limit to what we can achieve." The town of Brookfield was transforming, one conversation, one workshop, and one basketball game at a time. The ripple effect of that fateful encounter on Maple Street was spreading, touching lives and inspiring hope for a brighter future. While the progress in Brookfield was encouraging, it wasn't without its challenges. Not everyone in the community was on board with the changes. Some residents remained skeptical, questioning whether the initiatives would lead to lasting improvement. A few officers, too, resisted the new approach, clinging to old habits and mindsets. One evening, the judge received a call from a concerned member of the advisory board. "We've got a problem," the board member said. "There's a group of officers who are pushing back against the bias training. They're saying it's unnecessary and that it's making their jobs harder." The judge sighed, knowing that resistance was inevitable. "Change is never easy," he said. "But we can't let a few voices derail what we're trying to accomplish. Let's address this head-on." At the next advisory board meeting, the tension was palpable. The judge opened the discussion by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised. "I know some of you feel that these changes are unnecessary or even counterproductive," he said. "But I want to remind everyone why we're here. This isn't about making anyone's job harder, it's about making our community stronger." One of the officers who had been resistant stood up to speak. "With all due respect, Judge, we're out there every day dealing with real problems. We don't have time for workshops and sensitivity training. We need to focus on keeping people safe." The judge listened carefully before responding. "I understand where you're coming from," he said. "But keeping people safe isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about building trust and understanding. If the community doesn't trust us, we can't do our jobs effectively." The officer hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I get that," he said finally. "But it's not easy to change the way we've always done things." The judge nodded. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. And it's not just about the community, it's about us, too. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. Acknowledging them and working to overcome them makes us better at what we do." The discussion continued, with others sharing their perspectives and experiences. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense of cautious optimism. While not everyone was fully on board, there was a willingness to keep the conversation going. Meanwhile, the officer who had pulled over the judge continued to face his own challenges. Despite his efforts to change, he still encountered skepticism from some of his colleagues. "You've gone soft," one of them joked during a break at the station. "Next thing you know, you'll be handing out hugs instead of tickets." The officer smiled but didn't laugh. "It's not about going soft," he said. "It's about doing our jobs better. If we can build trust with the community, we'll all be safer in the long run." His colleague shrugged, unconvinced, but the officer didn't let it discourage him. He knew that change took time and that he couldn't expect everyone to see things the way he did. All he could do was lead by example and hope that others would follow. As the weeks went by, the officer's persistence began to pay off. He noticed small but meaningful shifts in the attitudes of some of his colleagues. They started to engage more with the community, taking the time to listen and connect rather than simply enforcing the law. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The judge, too, saw signs of progress. The advisory board's initiatives were gaining traction, and the community was beginning to see the benefits. While there were still challenges to overcome, there was a growing sense of hope and determination. The journey was far from over, but the town of Brookfield was moving in the right direction. The judge and the officer, once divided by a tense encounter, were now united in their efforts to create a better future for their community. Together, they were proving that even the most deeply rooted issues could be addressed with understanding, empathy, and a commitment to change. Just as the town of Brookfield was beginning to see the fruits of its efforts, a new challenge emerged. A high-profile incident in a neighboring town reignited tensions and put the progress in Brookfield to the test. A young black man had been arrested under controversial circumstances, and the incident had sparked protests and calls for justice. The news spread quickly, and soon, Brookfield residents were also voicing their concerns. The judge knew that this was a critical moment. The incident served as a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done, not just in Brookfield but across the country. He called an emergency meeting of the advisory board to address the situation and ensure that the town's progress wasn't derailed. The meeting room was packed, with residents, officers, and local leaders all eager to share their thoughts. The atmosphere was tense, with emotions running high. The judge opened the discussion by acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "What happened in our neighboring town is a tragedy," he said. "And it's a reminder that we can't become complacent. We have to keep working to ensure that something like this doesn't happen here." One resident stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "We've been doing all this work, but what's the point if things like this keep happening? How do we know we're really making a difference?" The judge listened carefully before responding. "I understand your frustration," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always easy to see the impact of our efforts. But we can't let one incident undo all the progress we've made. We have to stay committed to the work we're doing." The police chief also addressed the crowd, his tone serious but hopeful. "We're not perfect," he said. "But we're trying to do better. We've implemented new policies and training programs, and we're committed to holding ourselves accountable. But we need your help. We need to keep having these conversations and working together." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The advisory board decided to organize a community forum to address the concerns raised by the incident and reaffirm their commitment to change. The forum was held a few days later, with residents and officers coming together to share their thoughts and ideas. The officer who had pulled over the judge played an active role in the forum, sharing his own journey and encouraging others to do the same. "I know it's not easy to change," he said. "But I've seen firsthand how much of a difference it can make. We all have a role to play in creating a better future for our community." The forum was a success, with residents and officers alike expressing a willingness to keep the conversation going. While the incident in the neighboring town had been a setback, it also served as a catalyst for renewed determination. As the weeks went by, the town of Brookfield continued to move forward. The advisory board's initiatives gained even more traction, and the community began to see the benefits of their efforts. Trust between residents and officers grew stronger, and the town became a model for others to follow. The judge and the officer, once divided by a tense encounter, were now united in their efforts to create a better future. They knew that the journey was far from over, but they were committed to seeing it through. Together, they were proving that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. Months had passed since the incident in the neighboring town, and Brookfield had emerged stronger than ever. The community forum had been a turning point, galvanizing residents and officers alike to redouble their efforts. The town was becoming a shining example of what could be achieved through dialogue, understanding, and a shared commitment to change. The youth outreach program, spearheaded by the officer who had once pulled over the judge, had grown exponentially. What started as a basketball tournament had evolved into a full-fledged initiative, with weekly events that brought together young people and law enforcement. The program had become a cornerstone of the community, fostering trust and understanding between generations. One Saturday afternoon, the judge attended a community cleanup event organized by the youth outreach program. He watched as teenagers and officers worked side by side, picking up litter and planting flowers in the local park. The atmosphere was lively and full of laughter, a testament to the bonds that had been formed. The officer approached the judge, a smile on his face. "It's amazing to see how far we've come," he said. "I never would have imagined something like this when we first met." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a reminder of what's possible when we work together. But we can't stop here. We have to keep pushing forward." The officer agreed. "We've made a lot of progress, but there's still more to do. I'm committed to keeping this momentum going." As the cleanup event continued, the judge took a moment to reflect on the journey they had been on. He thought about the tense encounter on Maple Street, the difficult conversations that had followed, and the small but meaningful steps that had led to this moment. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Later that evening, the advisory board held its monthly meeting. The room was filled with a sense of optimism, as members discussed the progress that had been made and the initiatives that were still in the works. The police chief presented a report on the department's efforts to reduce bias and improve accountability, highlighting the positive impact of the new policies and training programs. The judge addressed the group, his voice filled with pride. "We've come a long way, but we can't become complacent. We have to keep challenging ourselves and each other to do better. The work we're doing here is important, not just for Brookfield but for communities everywhere." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose, as members discussed plans for future initiatives. The advisory board had become a driving force for change, and its impact was being felt throughout the town. As the judge left the meeting, he felt a sense of hope and determination. He knew that the journey was far from over, but he was confident that they were on the right path. The town of Brookfield had been transformed, not by grand gestures but by small, consistent efforts to build understanding and trust. The officer, too, felt a sense of pride and purpose. He had come a long way since that fateful day on Maple Street, and he was committed to continuing his journey of growth and learning. Together, he and the judge had shown that even the most deeply rooted issues could be addressed with empathy, understanding, and a commitment to change. The town of Brookfield was a testament to the power of community and the importance of working together to create a better future. And as the judge and the officer looked to the future, they knew that the best was yet to come. The story of Brookfield had become a beacon of hope, not just for its residents but for neighboring towns and beyond. The judge and the officer, once strangers brought together by a tense encounter, had become symbols of what could be achieved through dialogue, understanding, and perseverance. Their partnership had sparked a movement that continued to grow, touching lives and inspiring change. 1 year after the incident on Maple Street, the town held a community celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event was held in the park that had been revitalized by the youth outreach program, now a vibrant space filled with laughter and life. Families, officers, and local leaders gathered to celebrate the journey they had been on together. The judge stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but the spirit of unity that made it possible," he said. "This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. We've shown that change is possible when we come together with open hearts and minds." The officer also addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. "I've learned so much over the past year, not just about others but about myself. This community has taught me the importance of listening, understanding, and growing. I'm proud to be a part of this town, and I'm committed to continuing this work." The celebration was a joyful occasion, with music, food, and activities for all ages. Children played games with officers, their laughter echoing through the park. Residents and officers shared stories and memories, their bond stronger than ever. It was a testament to the power of community and the impact of their collective efforts. As the sun set, the judge and the officer stood together, watching the festivities. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," the officer said. "That day on Maple Street feels like a lifetime ago." The judge nodded. It does. But it's a reminder of how much can change when we're willing to confront our biases and work together. This is just the beginning. The officer smiled. I'm ready for whatever comes next. We've built something special here, and I know it's only going to grow. The two men shook hands, their partnership a testament to the power of understanding and collaboration. They knew that the work was far from over, but they were confident in the foundation they had built. The town of Brookfield had become a model for others, a shining example of what could be achieved through empathy, dialogue, and a commitment to change. As the celebration continued, the judge and the officer joined the crowd, their hearts full of hope and pride. They had come a long way, but they knew that the journey was far from over. Together, they had created a legacy of change, one that would continue to inspire and uplift for generations to come. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the town of Brookfield stood as a testament to the power of unity, proving that even the smallest steps could lead to a brighter future.